I'm often asked the question about how can we use spreadsheets to automatically sort data from one master sheet onto separate sort of subsheets based on the data that's presented. So for this example here, I'm going to use a selection of students, and all I've got is their first name and their surname, and then their grade within a subject, for example. And what I'm going to do is organize them so that all the people with the grade A will appear on a sheet for the grade A's. All the people with the grade B will appear on the sheet for grade B. And you could use this for a whole variety of examples. Here I'm using grades in a subject, but it could be any sort of example where you need to sort data into separate sheets based on the entry in a certain column. And the clever thing here is that if a student's grade is changed, let's say Boris increases to A, he will now appear on the A sheet and he will disappear from the B sheet. I don't have to change anything on those sheets, he just disappears. So I'll put him back to B for this example. So the way that we need to create this. Now first of all, what I've done is I've got two hidden columns to the left of my data. So if I just bring those in to start with, and I'm just going to hide column B. So column A, I've worked out a mechanism for identifying the position of that person, where they're going to be on each sheet. Now it's a little bit confusing at first, but hopefully you'll follow it through. Now I'm just going to drag in the formula that I have used to create this. So if I just bring this onto the screen. So this is the formula that I have used to create this mechanism. So if I click in the cell A2, it's saying equals count if, and then I've got brackets, and then we've got this what looks like a little bit of an odd code, but if I actually highlight what's going on, it makes it a bit clearer. Now the count if has two parts to it, and it's separated by a comma. The first part is the range, and the second part is the criteria that you are counting. So what I've set up here is the range is E2 to E2, so it's effectively a single cell, and we're going to count how many items within that range match whatever value is in E2, which in this case is the letter A. Now of course that gives us the number 1. Now the clever thing here is that when I added the range E2 to E2, I made the first part of it what is called absolute, and that's done by adding these dollar signs before the E and the 2. Now what that means is when I copy the formula down into the next cell, because the first part is absolute, and we have to look in the top bar to see it, that stays as E2, but the other part isn't absolute. That's what's called relative, so that increases because I've copied down, so that's become E3. So again, if I now click on it, you can see the blue box shows me the range, so it is the cells E2 and E3, and we're then counting how many times the value in E3, which is the letter B, appears, which of course is once. If I go into the next one, and again I click, the range has increased by 1. So we've got the range E2, E3, and E4, and we're counting how many times whatever the value in E4 is, which is letter A. And you'll see there that there are 2 letter A's. So it's given us the number 2. So what this is effectively doing is, if I look in the row 2, it's saying that is the first letter A. The next one is saying it's the first letter B. This one is the second letter A. We then have the third letter A, the first letter C, etc. So if I just change this to a letter A, you will see how all the numbers change. We now have the fourth letter A and the fifth letter A. And as you change, the numbers will change accordingly. So it's quite simple, but it's quite clever and effective. So I'm now going to introduce this other column that I had hidden, and all this is doing is it's what's called concatenating. I'm basically creating a new bit of text based on the value in the E column, which is the one that we're kind of working with, and then the value in my A column. So I'm basically just putting the two together, and that gives me this unique code. So I've got A1 means the first A value, B1 is the first B value, and then A2 is the second A value, etc. So that's the clever bit for sort of sorting out the data on my data sheet. We're now going to go into my first sheet. So this is for the letter A. Now, again, I've got a hidden column. So I'm just going to show you that hidden column. And what I've done is in the top left cell, I've got the letter A. Now we could just type it in. I've actually used a formula. I'll come back to that later to explain why I've done that. But the key is whatever value is in this top cell, A1, is going to be the thing that we're filtering by effectively. Now, if I come down into the next cell, what we have is a mechanism for creating the values A1, then A2, then A3. Now, I could just type A1 and then A2 and then copy it down, but that doesn't work so well later on. So what I've done is I've used a similar formula to before, and I've just got equals and then $A$1, which is again an absolute reference to this top cell, so it'll always pull the letter A. And then I've got and then row brackets brackets -1. Now the row function will return the row that you are currently on. So when I'm in cell A2, it would return the value 2 because that's the row that I'm in. Now I don't want this value to be A2, I want it to be A1, so I have to do -1. So it's just the row value -1. And if you're creating your own sheets, you might have extra header rows above and you'd have to adjust these numbers for it to work, but hopefully you can work the logic through. So that's given us this value here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look up that value in the data table and then return the information that we want to the right. And that is done in this sort of formula here. Now I'm going to bring the full formula across again in a box and just make it a little bit smaller for you so that we can see it. So that's what the formula looks like. Now it's a little bit complex, but what we've got is a VLOOKUP function, which is the bit in red, and then around it I've got an error function. Now the error function means that if it's basically blank, it just shows nothing. That's all that bit's doing. But let's unpick the VLOOKUP first. Now VLOOKUP is a very powerful tool, and it's got 4 parts to it. So if I just click on the VLOOKUP part, the first part, which I've shown in this second box in green, is saying $A2. Now the dollar before the A means that when I copy the formula across, the A will always stay as A. Now the number 2 will increase, that will become 3, 4, 5 as I go down, but when I go right, it will stay the same. So that's basically saying look up the value in the left-hand column, either A1 or A2 or A3, depending on which row you're in. The next part of the VLOOKUP is the range. So this is the range that you're looking up. Now we're looking on a different sheet. The sheet is called data, and that's shown up as data exclamation mark. And the range that I'm going to look up is B2 to Z100. Now B2 is this cell here, and Z is all the columns going across to the letter Z. I'm going off the screen. I've basically made it bigger than I need it so that if I add columns in the future, it still works. And likewise, I've gone down to the row 101 effectively, even though there's no data in it at the moment. I'm just making it bigger than I need to make it easier in the future. Now with a VLOOKUP function, what you do is you then tell it which column of data you want to return. So normally, if I was wanting to return the first name and I was looking up a big table like so, I'm wanting to return the second column. When I'm wanting the surname, I'd return the third column, and when I want the grade, I'd be returning the fourth column. So it's not the column within the table, within the spreadsheet, it's the column within the range lookup. Now in this case, rather than me putting in the numbers 2, 3, or 4, what I'm actually going to do is just use the column function, which is similar to the row function. So when I'm in the B column, the column function is worth 2 because it's the second column. When I'm in the C column, it would be worth 3 because I'm in the third column. So in this case, it just works neatly. In your situations, you might have to do a +1 or a -1 or a plus certain numbers, etc. Now the final part of the VLOOKUP is either true or false. Now if you're working with exact numbers and you use false, it will only return something if it can find an exact match. So that's what we want here. So that's why we've got the false as the example. So the clever thing with this is I can add this formula or create this formula in my cell B2. I can then simply copy it down and I can copy it across, and it will then pull all the data through quite nicely. If in the future I decide that I want to add the name of the tutor that taught them, I can add that column into my data table. I can then just come into here and I can just add tutor at the top, and I can just expand my formula across and it will pull the data through for me. So that's the basic mechanism. Now I can hide the A column if I want to, so it's tidied up. I don't have to. And I mentioned earlier about this top cell and how I'd used a formula. Now the formula is quite it's quite a complex one. I don't actually understand how it works. It just works. I've just borrowed it off the internet. Let's make it a little bit smaller so you can see it. And this will be posted in the notes. If you're accessing this through my blog, you'll be able to pull this formula off from the notes. Now what it does is it's basically pulling the sheet name. So I've called my sheet A. It's therefore put the value A in the top corner. Now the reason I've done that is I'm just going to go to my sheet B. If I was setting this up to create lots of sheets, I'm not going to go through and set up this mechanism each time. I just create one sheet once as a template. I'm then going to right click, move or copy, and I'm going to create a copy, which I move to the end. I'm then going to rename that as sheet C. Now that's automatically changed the value in that top cell to the value C, and then everything else has worked. So it's very quick for me to just create all the sheets that I need. I'm just going to duplicate and then rename, and it will give me all the sheets that I need with the different letters in. So I'll just do one for U, and that gives me the U entry. So that's a simple mechanism for getting a way of sorting my data from a data sheet into subsequent other sheets. Now the key thing with this approach is I can only do this for viewing the subsequent sheets. I can't have a mechanism where people then enter additional information into these sort of subsheets, because as soon as anything on the data sheet changes, these subsheets will also change, in that they will change the order or things will move from one to another. So you can't use this as a way of adding additional information. It's just a way of summarizing, and you could then always take an exact copy of the sheet and just copy the values to send to a person if they need to see one particular set. So that's been a relatively quick introduction. You may not have followed the full workings. I will put a copy of this template file into the presentation so you can have a look at the formulas yourself. I've only used a couple of columns, so first name, surname, and grade. You could have as many columns as you like. You just got to replicate the process and expand the column within the VLOOKUP mechanism.